A Hollywood legend, a forgotten actress, a chance encounter that would change everything. When Clint Eastwood pulls over for a homeless elderly woman, he has no idea he's about to rewrite a story decades in the making. But as the truth unfolds, his actions shock the world, proving that even in the toughest of men, there's still room for compassion. What he does next will leave you speechless. The coastal winds howled through the empty streets of Carmel by the sea, carrying a chill that bit through even the thickest of coats. Clint Eastwood, now in his 90s, had seen many nights like this before. The kind that reminded him of the passage of time, of how the world never stops moving, no matter how many years a man has lived. His classic Lincoln Continental glided down the dimly lit road. The headlights cut through the mist rolling in from the Pacific, creating eerie shadows along the sidewalks. Clint wasn't a man prone to distractions, but something ahead made him tap the brakes. There, hunched over on the curb, was an elderly woman wrapped in a tattered blanket, her silver hair tangled in the wind. For a moment, he considered driving on. He'd spent a lifetime minding his own business, surviving that way. But something in her face pulled at him, like a ghost from the past whispering his name. With a sigh, he turned the wheel and pulled over. Clint Eastwood had never been one for hesitation, but as he stepped out of his car and approached the frail woman on the curb, he felt something strange. A pull, a connection he couldn't quite place. The woman sat hunched over, her thin fingers clutching the edges of a worn-out blanket. Her face, weathered by time and hardship, barely lifted as he approached. "Ma'am," Clint's deep, gravelly voice broke the silence. "You okay?" The woman flinched slightly, as if startled by the sudden attention. Then, slowly, she looked up. Clint froze. Her eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, were strikingly familiar. "You, need some help?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Ain't much left to help, mister." That voice. Clint felt a memory stirring, something from decades ago. A smoky room, a young woman in a dazzling dress, a voice full of hope and ambition. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated before muttering, "Maggie. Maggie Dawson." It hit Clint like a punch to the gut. He knew that name. Maggie Dawson had been a rising star once. In the 1950s, when Hollywood was a golden beacon of dreams, she was one of the hopefuls. An actress with talent, beauty, and an undeniable screen presence. Clint remembered her from those early days when he himself was just another unknown trying to break into the industry. They had met at a casting call for a low-budget Western. Clint had landed a minor role, but Maggie had shined. She had been on the brink of success, appearing in a handful of films before suddenly vanishing from Hollywood's spotlight. And now, decades later, she was here. Homeless. Forgotten. "You used to act," Clint murmured, more to himself than to her. Maggie let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, a long time ago. Ain't much use now, is it?" Clint frowned. "What happened?" Maggie sighed, shifting uncomfortably. "Life happened, cowboy." One bad decision after another. Trusted the wrong people, lost everything. She gestured vaguely at the empty street. "This is where I ended up." Clint looked at her, then at the dark road stretching ahead. He had seen a lot in his time. Men rising and falling, fortunes made and lost. But there was something about seeing Maggie like this that didn't sit right with him. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked. Maggie let out a dry laugh. "If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here, would I?" Clint sighed. He wasn't the kind of man who made decisions lightly, but in that moment something in him shifted. "Come on," he said, tilting his head toward his car. Maggie blinked. "What?" "I ain't leaving you out here." She hesitated, eyes searching his for a reason to say no, but there was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet determination. After a long moment, she nodded. "All right, cowboy. But don't say I didn't warn you. I ain't exactly good company these days." Clint smirked. "I'll take my chances." Clint drove in silence for a while, letting Maggie warm up inside the car. He took her to a small motel, paid for a room, and made sure she had food. What he didn't expect was for someone to take a picture. By the next morning, a grainy image of Clint Eastwood helping a homeless woman into his car had surfaced online. Within hours, the internet was buzzing. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood rescues homeless woman. Her identity will shock you. News outlets picked up the story, piecing together Maggie Dawson's lost history. People were stunned. How had a promising actress from Hollywood's golden era ended up on the streets? And more importantly, why had no one noticed? Maggie, still reeling from the sudden change in her circumstances, stared at the TV in disbelief as news anchors spoke her name for the first time in decades. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered. Clint just shook his head. "Guess the world still loves a comeback story." By noon, Clint's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. His agent, old friends, even reporters he hadn't spoken to in years were calling, all wanting to know the same thing. Was the story true? Clint ignored most of the calls. He wasn't interested in explaining himself. He had done what felt right, and that was all there was to it. But the world wasn't letting this go. Maggie sat across from him in the motel room, holding a cup of coffee Clint had picked up for her. She looked at him over the rim. "You didn't think this would go unnoticed, did you?" He let out a low chuckle. "Didn't think about it at all." Maggie shook her head. "Well, you should have. You're Clint damn Eastwood." He raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to mean something?" She smirked. "To you? Maybe not. To the rest of the world, everything." The truth was, Maggie didn't know what to do with all this sudden attention. She had spent so many years being invisible that she wasn't sure she wanted to be seen again. But Clint? He had just walked straight into her life, kicked the dust off her story, and now the world was Lou. That evening, an unexpected visitor knocked on the motel door. Clint opened it to find a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s holding a tablet in one hand and adjusting his glasses with the other. "Mr. Eastwood," the man said, smiling politely. "I'm Mark Levinson, a producer from Warner Brothers." Clint sighed. "If you're here for a story, I ain't got one for you." Levinson shook his head. "I'm actually here for her." He nodded toward Maggie, who was sitting on the bed, watching the interaction with wary eyes. Maggie leaned back, crossing her arms. "What do you want, hotshot?" Levinson hesitated, then stepped forward. "To apologize." Maggie frowned. "For what?" "For forgetting you," he said simply. "For letting someone with your talent slip through the cracks," she scoffed. "Bit late for that, don't you think?" Levinson smiled. "Maybe, but Hollywood loves a redemption arc." He tapped his tablet. "There's a role in an upcoming film. Nothing big, but meaningful. If you're interested, I'd love to have you read for it." Maggie blinked, as if trying to process what she had just heard. Clint leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You serious?" Levinson nodded. "Absolutely." For the first time in years, Maggie felt something stir inside her. Not just nostalgia, but possibility. She looked at Clint. "What do you think, cowboy?" He smirked. "I think it's about damn time." A week later, Maggie stepped onto a film set for the first time in over 50 years. The world was watching, waiting to see if this lost star could still shine. And when the cameras rolled, she proved that some things, like talent, like resilience, never fade. Clint watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. He had always believed in redemption, in second chances. And Maggie Dawson? She was making the most of hers. Months later, Maggie Dawson stood on stage at a Hollywood event, a standing ovation roaring around her. She looked out at the crowd, then at Clint, who gave her a small nod from his seat. With tears in her eyes, she gripped the microphone. "I was lost. Forgotten. But one man stopped, looked me in the eye, and reminded me that I still mattered." She smiled. "So, if there's one thing you take from this, let it be this. Never underestimate the power of kindness." Clint tipped his hat. And just like that, he had rewritten the ending of a story that was never meant to be forgotten. Some stories are too powerful to be forgotten, just like this one. If you love tales of kindness, redemption, and the unexpected twists of fate, hit that subscribe button and join us at Tailcraft for more unforgettable stories.